I've never made a game before, so I challenged myself to make one in 3 months. My goal is to have a playable demo ready before Steam Next Fest this October, and it may be a little too ambitious for someone completely new to game development, but I created a checklist of all the movement mechanics I wanted in the game, and the first thing was the crouch. That couldn't be too hard, right? I created a new input action, mapped it to shift, and set up a blueprint using Unreal's built-in crouch nodes. Then I adjusted the crouch walk speed and checked the can crouch box. Once I figured that out, I had to set up an animation. I found a free animation pack and imported it, made a new blend space and connected everything, then could test it. Instead of crouch walking, the character just glid across the ground in an idle animation. I reconfigured the blend space and tried the animation again, and this time it walked, just not correctly. After a few hours of reworking it, I created a simpler blend space hoping that would work, and it finally did. 2 days later, we can finally cross the first thing off the list. If everything takes this long, I'm gonna be in some trouble. But now I need to add a sprint mechanic. I created a new input action, mapped it to caps, and created a custom start and stop sprint function. I used custom variables to set the sprint speed and bring it back down to walk speed. Once I had set up a blueprint, I could test it. The sprint speed was a bit too high, but after I lower that I can mark this off the list and work on something a little cooler. To make sliding feel intentional, I added a branch after the crouch that checks if the player is both sprinting and crouching. To check if both conditions were met, I used a print string that displayed text when the branch was true, and when I tested it, it worked so I can implement the slide logic. I used ground friction and braking deceleration nodes to make it feel like a proper slide and tested it. But after the slide ended, the friction stayed low, so I needed to create logic to stop sliding and reset the values. I added a branch to the event tick to check if the player was sliding, and if it was true it checked the player's speed and reset the braking and ground friction to default when the speed dropped too low. I tested it, and it worked. I wanted the slide to give a forward boost, so I added a launch character node. I wasn't exactly sure how to set it up, but once I thought I had it, I gave it a test. But I did not expect this. I reconfigured the launch node and tried it again, but instead of blasting off this time I kind of just floated away. So I adjusted it again, but this time it was super close, just way too fast. I lowered the strength again and tested it, but now it was super bumpy. This was due to the launch being played every frame, so I connected a delay and gave it another shot. It seemed like it was all working properly, but then I noticed if I kept sliding through the delay, the character would be launched again. I added another branch with the is crouching condition and set it to replay a 0.1 second delay until the player had uncrouched to get the launch back. I made a new state in the state machine, named it slide, and connected the animation to the output. I set up conditions for the animation to play, but it wouldn't transition back to the running animation, and I noticed that I can do the slide standing still. I reworked the animation conditions with a speed check, and that fixed the idle slide animation, but I still needed to make conditions to transition back to walking. I set up something I thought would work, and it didn't, so I replaced the and boolean with an or, and it actually functioned correctly. Now I can cross this off the list and make a dash. I used the same launch character logic from the slide and made a new can dash boolean to connect to the delay so you can't spam it, and I gave it a try. I didn't like how the dash always moved where the camera was pointing, so I replaced the forward vector node with the last movement vector, and I was able to dash in any direction. Now that the dash was finished, I wanted to make a wall climb. I made a custom function and set the start and end of a line trace to determine if I'm close enough to a wall to climb it and connected the return node. I set up a custom event with a timeline so after a short duration, the climb would be stopped and connected the line trace function. If the line trace hit something, the character would be launched upward until the timeline stopped. I connected a stop timeline node to the false output of the branch so if the line trace misses, the wall climb will be stopped. I triggered the volt trace using the jump input, and if the line trace didn't hit anything, the player would jump, but if it hit something, the timeline and the launch character would trigger. I tested it out and couldn't believe it worked. I wanted the climb to end if the camera was facing too far from the wall, so I used a dot product to check where the player is facing in the line trace function and tested it. I also added a wall jump mechanic, so I set up a couple walls to test everything, and ended up spending more time than I'd like to admit just hopping between them. Not the smartest move with a deadline this close, but maybe that's a good sign? Either way, I moved on to wall running, and for once I actually understood what I was doing. I used collision boxes to detect if the player was close enough to a wall-to-wall run. To trigger the wall run, I used on-component begin overlap nodes and end overlap nodes. I copied the line trace from the wall climb to use in the wall run, but looking back on it, this was completely useless. I could have just adjusted the size of the collision boxes to make the player fall if they looked too far from the wall, but you live and you learn. I tested the collision boxes to see if they'd trigger a print string on overlap, but nothing happened. I had to set the walls to generate overlap events, but once I knew that I could check the same box for the other wall. I scaled down the collision boxes and added print strings so I'd know when they updated and when I'm able to wall run. Then I tested the useless dot product, but at least I knew it worked. I added a timer to set the player to fly and so they would stay suspended in the air, and connected a stop wall run function to the dot product and the end overlap node. I set a branch to only allow wall running when the player is falling, so you won't enter wall run state by walking next to the walls. I tested it with high hopes, and it worked better than I would have even imagined. I could jump next to a wall to gain height as I was wall running, but best of all it blended seamlessly with the wall climb and wall jump. But before I could cross it off the list, I needed to make a better test level.